Hello guys, my name is Mustafa and we'll be going over vascular physiology today. So the topics that we'll be covering in this lecture will be coronary circulation and coronary flow reserve, cerebral circulation, pulmonary circulation, placental and fetal circulation, cardiovascular responses to hemorrhage, cardiovascular reflexes, autostasis, and cardiopulmonary response to exercise. So coronary circulation is the blood flow that supplies the heart muscle, which is called the myocardium. The perfusion of the coronary arteries happens when the heart is relaxed. So this is called diastole, and this it occurs during diastole because as the myocardium is relaxed, the coronary arteries are not compressed, are not occluded, so they can fill with blood. Whereas during systole, when the myocardium is contracting and the arteries are compressed, there is reduced blood flow. So let's just quickly go over the anatomy of the coronary circulation. There are two main vessels that make up the coronary circulation, and these are called the left and the right main coronary arteries. Where these originate from is from the openings at the base of the aorta, and these are called the left and the right aortic sinuses. And these aortic sinuses are found behind the flaps of the aortic valve. So you know how the aortic valve has three flaps or three cusps, and so when the heart is relaxed after systole, there's a backflow of the blood that fills these valve pockets. So when these pockets fill, they then allow for the blood to enter into the coronary arteries. So you can see in this picture, here is the left main coronary artery. It splits into two main branches, the circumflex artery and the left descending anterior descending artery. And on the other side, there is the right coronary artery, and this gives rise to what is called the right marginal artery and the posterior interventricular artery, which goes towards the back. So how is the coronary circulation controlled? The blood flow is controlled almost entirely by local metabolic factors. These are such as adenosine and oxygen availability. Also, sympathetic innervation during the flight and flight response also plays a minor role. It uses these factors to exhibit autoregulation called active and reactive hyperemia. When a heart is beating under stress during, for example, the flight and fight response, its oxygen consumption increases, depleting the available oxygen. In hypoxia, so when the available oxygen is depleted and there is a state of hypoxia, there is a build-up of metabolites such as ADP and AMP, which are degraded to adenosine, and this adenosine is a potent vasodilator. Alongside adenosine, there are other metabolites such as nitric oxide and prostaglandins, which also cause vasodilation of the coronary arteries. So when the coronary vessels vasodilate, there is an increase in the blood flow to the myocardium. Increased blood flow due to increased metabolic activity is called active hyperemia. During systole, the mechanical compression of the coronary vessels reduces the blood flow, which causes a temporary hypoxia. This is the other mechanism of autoregulation called reactive hyperemia. So when there is a state of temporary hypoxia during systole, and then when diastole occurs and the myocardium relaxes, the period of occlusion is over and the blood flow increases slightly to overcome the oxygen debt. So this is called the reactive hyperemia. So there's two: active hyperemia, which is increased blood flow due to increased metabolic activity, and then there is the reactive hyperemia, which is the increase in the blood flow during diastole to repay the oxygen debt. So what is the coronary flow reserve? The CFR is the amount of additional blood flow that can be supplied to the heart above the resting blood flow. So this means that at rest, the blood flow, the blood that is flowing through the coronary vessels is at a much lower level than the maximum possible blood flow that is able to be reached. So the difference is what is called the coronary flow reserve. It can be thought of as the capacity of the coronary circulation to dilate and thus increase the flow following an increase in their myocardial metabolic demands. So let's talk about cerebral circulation now. This is also known as the cerebral vascular system, and it is made up of vessels that transport blood to and from the brain. As the brain is one of the major organs of the body, and it is also one of the organs that consumes the largest amount of oxygen and nutrients. Its efficient vascularization of the brain is necessary for its efficient function. So to ensure the smooth functioning of the brain has a dual arterial supply, which is provided by a pair of internal carotid arteries that are anterior of the brain and a pair of vertebral arteries that are posterior of the brain, and these eventually anastomose and form the circle of Willis in the brain. The dual blood supply provides collateral blood flow, meaning that the brain is protected against ischemia if, for example, one of the arteries is occluded for any reason. An efficient circulation is required for the brain, otherwise the lack of oxygen to the brain can cause strokes or seizures, coma, and even possibly death. So this is just a diagram demonstrating the circle of Willis, which is here, and posterior of the brain here, you can see the vertebral artery. So this pair of vertebral arteries here, they eventually join together to form the basilar artery here, and then the circle of Willis here. This section of the vessels you can see here is the pair of internal carotid arteries, which later become the middle cerebral arteries here. So before here, these are called the internal carotid arteries here, and afterwards they are called the middle cerebral artery. So control of the cerebral circulation. Blood flow to the brain is auto-regulated by local metabolic factors similar to the coronary circulation. But here, these factors include the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, the partial pressure of oxygen, the concentration of hydrogen ions, and substances that are released by astrocytes that cause vasodilation. Sympathetic innervation also plays a minor role in the cerebrovascular regulation. The most important local vasodilator for the cerebral circulation is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So any increases in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, these indicate that there's increased metabolic activity of the brain. These result in vasodilation of the cerebral arterioles and increased blood flow to the brain. So any decreases in partial pressure of carbon dioxide that may occur via hyperventilation, they can cause vasoconstriction of the cerebral arterioles and decreased blood flow to the brain. Myogenic autoregulation allows for the cerebral blood flow to change depending on the blood pressure. In hypertension, vasoconstriction occurs to restrict the blood flow. And in hypotension, when there's low blood pressure, vasodilation occurs to increase the blood flow and prevent syncope. Pulmonary circulation is the movement of the blood from the heart to the lungs for oxygenation. From the right ventricle, the blood is pumped through the pulmonary artery towards the lungs. The pulmonary artery splits into the right and left pulmonary arteries, that which then travel to each lung. At the lungs, the blood travels through the capillary beds surrounding the alveoli, where respiration occurs, and this is the place where carbon dioxide is removed from the blood and oxygen enters into the blood. The alveoli are air sacs in the lungs that provide the surface for gas exchange during respiration. The oxygenated blood then leaves the lungs through pulmonary veins, which returns it to the left atrium, and then this completes the pulmonary circuit. The blood is then distributed around the body when the left ventricle pumps it into the aorta. So there are a few adaptations specific to the pulmonary circulation, which facilitate the high blood volumes that flow through it. There is a low pressure in the pulmonary circulation relative to the systemic circulation. The mean arterial pressure is around 5 to 15 millimeters of mercury compared to the systemic circulation, which is around 93 millimeters of mercury. This is because the pulmonary arteries have thinner walls and they have higher compliance, allowing them to carry more blood. Low resistance is another adaptation specific to the pulmonary circulation. The pulmonary vessels are shorter and they are wider compared to the vessels in the systemic circulation. Additionally, pulmonary capillaries run in parallel to each other rather than in series like the systemic circulation. There is also relatively little smooth muscle in the arterioles, which helps to reduce arterial tone. These properties allow this pulmonary circulatory system to operate at a lower resistance. To promote the most efficient gas exchange with the alveoli and to produce the maximum transport capacity to carry oxygen and carbon dioxide, the pulmonary capillaries have a large surface area and a short diffusion distance, and there also occurs a phenomenon called the hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. This phenomenon occurs in response to low oxygen levels in certain areas of the lungs to increase the efficiency of gas exchange. The ventilation perfusion ratio, or VQ ratio, is kept optimal when the ventilation of the alveoli is matched by their perfusion. To maintain this VQ ratio, blood is diverted away from the poorly ventilated alveoli and directed towards better ventilated alveoli. This occurs through vasoconstriction of the small hypoxic pulmonary arteries or arterioles. So placental and fetal circulation. During pregnancy, the fetal circulatory system works differently than after birth. There are 4 key adaptations or structures that are unique to fetal circulation. These are the umbilical veins and arteries located within the umbilical cord. There is a structure called the ductus venosus, foramen ovale, and ductus arteriosus. The ductus venosus, foramen ovale, and ductus arteriosus are 3 shunts in a fetus's circulatory system required to divert or shunt the blood away from specific organs. These organs are the lungs and the liver, which are not fully functional or mature during this stage, and so these shunts are required to bypass them. So what is the pathway of blood flow in a fetus? As the lungs are not mature, and there cannot be any gas exchange here, and therefore oxygenation of fetal blood occurs in the placenta from the mother's blood. So this blood that is enriched with oxygen and nutrients from the mother's blood travels from the placenta through the umbilical vein in the umbilical cord to reach the baby's liver. A shunt here, which is called the ductus venosus, connects the umbilical vein to the inferior vena cava. This allows for some blood to enter. This also allows for some blood to enter into the liver, but majority of the oxygenated blood enters into the inferior vena cava, bypassing the liver and entering the right atrium of the heart. So you can see in this diagram, oxygenated blood from the placenta travels through the umbilical vein and reaches the liver. And here there is a shunt. This shunt is called the ductus venosus, and the majority of the blood is bypasses the liver and enters into the inferior vena cava here. So as the inferior vena cava carries deoxygenated blood from other areas of the body, when the oxygenated blood from the placenta enters it becomes mixed. So there is a mix of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood here in the inferior vena cava now, and it then travels to the right atrium. The ductus venosus also allows for some blood to enter into the liver, and this is deoxygenated, and this blood becomes deoxygenated and it re-enters into the inferior vena cava as well to enter into the right atrium of the heart. So from the right atrium, the blood has to bypass the lungs because the lungs are not functional at this stage. Because the lungs are not functional at this stage. So to bypass the lungs, there is a shunt in the interatrial septum right here in this bottom diagram. This is an opening between the right atrium and the left atrium. So the mixed blood in the right atrium travels into the left atrium through this shunt. This shunt is called the foramen ovale. So the foramen ovale, like I said, is an opening in the interatrial septum, and it allows for the bypassing of the lungs. When the mixed blood enters into the left atrium, it then moves into the left ventricle and is then pumped around the body through the aorta. Some blood also manages to enter into the pulmonary artery from the right ventricle. And so once it's in the pulmonary artery of the fetus, it has to be diverted back towards the aorta, and this occurs through a shunt called the ductus arteriosus. This is located between the pulmonary artery and the aorta, right here in this bottom diagram. So the waste products from the fetus have to travel back through the umbilical artery in the umbilical cord, and then into the placenta, into the mother's circulation to be removed. This this cycle then continues until birth in the fetus. So this is just a diagram which just shows all of the adaptations that the fetal circulation has. Starting from the placenta here, then the umbilical cord, ductus venosus right here, just before the liver, and the foramen ovale in between the right atrium and left atrium, and the ductus arteriosus between the pulmonary artery and the aorta. So the cardiovascular response to hemorrhage. A hemorrhage is the loss of blood from a ruptured vessel. It can be caused by trauma, upper GI bleeding, for example, variceal bleeding, or it could be caused by postpartum hemorrhage or a ruptured aneurysm. When blood loss is high, arterial pressure rapidly decreases, followed by a series of compensatory cardiovascular responses to try to restore the arterial pressure to normal and sustain the perfusion of critical organs. Arterial pressure decreases because of reduced intravascular fluid volume. This intravascular fluid volume is also called the extracellular fluid volume, which causes decreased cardiac output. To compensate for reduced cardiac output, the cardiovascular system increases the heart rate, which is called tachycardia, and also increases the systemic vascular resistance. These responses are mediated by the sympathetic stimulation and the RAS activation. RAS stands for renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So the cardiovascular reflexes. Cardiovascular reflexes are CNS-mediated mechanisms that contribute to the control of the cardiac functions, such as heart rate or blood pressure, etc., to maintain physiological homeostasis. The diving reflex is when the head of a person is immersed within cold water, and this triggers peripheral vasoconstriction and cerebral vasodilation, redirecting blood to the heart and the brain, slowing down the heart rate, and this optimizes respiration. The Valsalva reflex is when a person forcefully exhales against a closed airway, for example, holding the nose, and then this causes changes in the intrathoracic pressure, which in turn affects the venous return, the cardiac output, the arterial pressure, and the heart rate. During this maneuver, the heart rate briefly decreases and then increases, and then afterwards it returns to normal. The Muller maneuver is when the patient attempts to inhale with his mouth and his nostrils closed, which leads to a collapse of the airway. This also causes changes in the intrathoracic pressure and thus affecting the heart rate and arterial pressure. Autostasis is a normal physiological response of the sympathetic nervous system to counteract a reduction in the blood pressure when a person is lying down and assumes the upright position. So what happens is when a person is standing up too quickly from lying down, the blood pools in the veins of the lower limbs. This decreases the venous return to the heart and decreases cardiac output. The decrease in the cardiac output decreases the mean arterial pressure and leading to decrease in the cerebral perfusion and eventually leading to dizziness and possible syncope. So to avoid this, the carotid sinus baroreceptors detect the decrease in the blood pressure. This increases the sympathetic activity in the heart. This increases heart rate and the vascular resistance to maintain blood pressure. This here should be maintained more bad. Cardiopulmonary response to exercise. So during exercise, the demand for oxygen and the production of carbon dioxide increase by the skeletal muscles. So cardiopulmonary responses also occur to match these changes. The responses involve the central nervous system and local mechanisms as well. CNS responses include changes in the autonomic nervous system due to inputs from the cerebral motor cortex that receive information from the baroreceptors and the chemoreceptors. The local responses to exercise are there's an increase in the blood flow and the oxygen delivery to the skeletal muscles due to vasodilation caused by the metabolites. Exercise results in increased sympathetic and decreased parasympathetic activity in the heart. This results in increased cardiac output from the increased heart rate. The increase in the sympathetic activity also increases the ventilation rate to match the increase in oxygen demand and carbon dioxide production. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope this was useful. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me on my email. And if I could just ask you to take a minute out to fill in the feedback form, it will be very useful for us to analyze how we are doing and how the teaching is, and if we can make any improvements. Thank you very much.